If you've already read that thumbnail and title, you've probably come here already holding an opinion on this subject. So before we get into any of the nitty-gritty, let's just answer that question. Do metal minis really suck? No. That's it. Done. Video over. Okay, look, obviously we need to unpack that a little bit more. So if you haven't clicked off already, let's have a conversation about why metal might not be the monster you think it is. We're going to discuss the common complaints towards metal miniatures, and we're going to discuss some of the solutions to them. Or, where they're based on misinformation, we'll try to maybe correct some of those misunderstandings and show why some companies still to this day choose metal as their material of choice for their miniatures. So before we get into all of that, please do consider subscribing to the channel, and if you get to the end of the video and you really enjoy it, give it a thumbs up. Let's talk about metal. Okay, this one has always kind of baffled me a little because the processes for prepping metal, resin, plastic miniatures, they're kind of all really similar. Regardless of what material we're using, your miniature prep experience is going to be broken down pretty much into scraping mold lines, gluing joins together, and maybe optionally fill in some gaps. If anything, the very fact that metal and by extension resin miniatures tend to come to you as the customer as either a single piece or just with some small casting gates attached actually kind of makes them a whole step less, or at least half a step less, than what you'll go through removing a plastic mini from its sprue before assembly. And don't get me wrong, there's definitely different formulas to metal that might require more or less scraping and filing, and files might not necessarily be a tool that you use every day if you only work with plastic miniatures. But in the wider world of hobbying, they're kind of considered a pretty staple tool. You'll often sand plastics, and files are just good for doing those rougher bits of that. I consider having a couple of files in my kit to be pretty essential these days. And at the same time, some metal miniatures are even just a very soft formula, and you can pretty much prep them the same way you'd prep a plastic, just scrape, scrape, scrape and done. The only place I'd ever really pull out a file for those is just to take off that little nub that comes from removing the gate. You know the one I mean. Like on that Space Marine backpack that you really hate. Yeah, that one. Let it never be said that I'm not willing to make sacrifices for your knowledge and entertainment. This Battletech miniature comes in 5 pieces: 2 arms, a backpack, a main body and a cannon. It's not pinned together or anything, it's just super glued, and it's also fully painted and finished. So after a fall from table height onto a carpeted floor, which I think we should all probably agree is the most likely trauma a miniature is going to face in its life, what would you expect the damage to be? At least a few chips, right? Surely, like, metals chip well easily. And I bet it's going to be in like 1,000,000 pieces because it wasn't pinned. Well, no. Metal miniatures, when prepped to best practice, are not even super fragile. Our guy here lost 1 piece, which was an extremity, and to be honest, I just didn't really glue it on very well. It's kind of my fault. And the whole miniature doesn't even have a single chip on it. So what's the secret? Why are my metal minis so much tougher than you might expect them to be? Especially considering that I'm not even pinning most of them. Well, there's really 2 things that make a huge difference to this: Rust-Oleum Crystal Clear and Superglue Accelerator. And again, these aren't specialist things. Most hobbyists, in my opinion, should have a decent can of clear coat and a good superglue accelerator in their arsenal. If you haven't, grab some because they're great. That Rust-Oleum in particular is a really, really good clear coat, and I really do love it. the matte finish that it says it is on the can is, well, that is a lie, I'll be honest. Compare it here to this picture that you've been looking at now of my SAS from Infinity beside a very matte painted Go Trek that, you know, really the metallics are the only shiny parts on it. And you can clearly see that it is a satin finish, but it's a very protective finish, which is what matters. And at the end of the day, if you don't like that satin and you do want a true matte, you can just squirt over the top of that with an actual proper flat matte varnish, something through an airbrush or maybe a can of Winsor & Newton professional matte varnish, something like that, and you will get to that true flat matte. Just keep those spray coats thin and you're not going to have a problem. And as for that accelerator, well, super glue has some really interesting, weird and advanced chemistry going on in it, and basically the rule is the quicker you cure it, the harder and more permanent the bond is. And CA accelerator, as you can imagine, cures super glue really fast, which makes it strong. Just do bear in mind that this reaction is exothermic, it produces heat, so be careful to keep your fingers clear when you're using a CA accelerator. And finally, before we move on, I should also point out pinning is important on big, heavy metal miniatures. The larger stuff you probably do want to go out and learn how to pin and use pins on because it weighs a lot. But your average infantry miniature is so light, it's just not going to fall with enough force to break those super glue joins. Okay, this one could, in fairness, be viewed as an extension of the first complaint, but I think there's enough about it that it's worth covering separately. As we've already discussed, the processes that we're using to clean metals, the actual things we're doing to them, are very similar to the things we do to plastic. So if prepping those metals is taking longer, realistically it's probably safe to assume it's not the material that's the cause of that. So what does that mean? Well, unfortunately, it's that most controversial of things that we as content creators hate to have to say, but it could mean that it's our fault as individuals. Honestly, I kind of ummed and ahed over how to even discuss this topic, but with all the power of my tiny little hobby brain, the only thing I can conclude is, if metals are taking us longer to prep, it must be because we're slowing down, which is maybe because of concerns that we carry about the material. I really just can't come up with a better explanation. Obviously, experience with the material will also play a role, so I accept that I might naturally be a bit quicker than others when prepping it because I have experience. But I hate prep. It's my least favourite part of the hobby, and while we've been talking about this, I've taken this Infinity Copperbot remote kit, which is one of the more complex metal kits that you're likely to see, and I've completely assembled it to readiness and cleaned it all up and everything while we've been having this little chat. And yes, the footage is sped up, but it took me 9 minutes and 42. And I can't honestly say that I would have been any quicker doing that if it was plastic. I don't feel like this is a sub 5 minute mini. So yeah, I really don't know about this one. I included it as a topic because it's such a large portion of the feedback that I get about metal miniatures, but truth be told, I'm finding it hard to lend any credence to the belief that they actually take longer to prep. Your mileage may vary? Yeah, they are, and that's definitely a shame, but I think we also have to maybe consider a few things about what kitbashing is, who its audience is, and also just the general state of miniatures in general these days. General state in general. I'm so shit at scripting. So firstly and most obviously, kitbashing just isn't for everyone, and I think that's a given. Some folks dabble, some folks don't touch it at all. For some folks it's their entire life, happiness and motivation within the hobby. It's everything that they love about it. There's a range to it, which means that how much of a problem this actually is definitely going to vary from person to person. And it could be that the majority of the people that complain about it are specifically people who really like to kitbash. I mean, I kitbashed together this Gaslands car from a metal car and some resin parts, and it was fine, but I was probably more enjoying the novelty than the process itself, so I'm definitely not those people. But even if you love kitbashing and it's all you do, we kind of need to think about where miniature design is at in 2021. More and more we're starting to see monopose kits now in plastic, and they're getting harder and harder to convert and kitbash to the point where elements that you might need to remove are buried amongst other detail, and if you cut it away, you kind of can't do that without breaking the miniature. So what this means is that the amount of modelling skill in order to convert and kitbash has dramatically risen, as you really need to be able to sculpt and tidy and clean and all that kind of. So if we're just talking about, lopping off a gun or a sword or something, it should be obvious that regardless of what the miniature's made of, that's really easy. And those of us that are actually willing to get in and properly kitbash, deeply kitbash those complex modern monopose kits, for those people it's probably not that much harder to kitbash metal kits. Ooh, this is a tough one. And I deliberately saved this till last, because by the rules of YouTube, the majority of you won't stick around long enough to watch this point and get mad at me for it, which is good. The idea that metals aren't as detailed as plastics is, well, it's kind of a narrative that's only really pushed by one source. And if you care about this enough, then you probably already know who that source is, and if you don't particularly care about this, you've probably already clicked through by now. But to really understand this, we kind of need to ask ourselves the question, what actually is detail, and how do different materials capture it? For many people, they're going to read detail as the number of elements in a sculpt, the amount of layers, if you will, the three-dimensional complexity of the piece as a whole. And in that regard, plastic definitely excels. When you have flexible, small components that don't break as easily, and you can use a glue that makes permanent bonds, layering up tons of overlapping small elements makes sense and brings a sense of detail to a model. But the question is that actually detail, or is that complexity? I mean, to me personally, I read detail very differently, and this could be a painter thing, but I consider it to be accurately rendered and super sharp holes, textures, lines, edges. It's surface fidelity. These are the things that my brain at least perceives as fine detail. And when it comes to these types of elements and how densely and sharply they can be rendered, metal is up there with the best materials on the planet and leaves even the best plastics leagues behind. And you've probably guessed this already, but Infinity is the game that really highlighted this to me. I realised through that game how fun and relaxing it could be painting these super crisp, super richly detailed sculpts. It's a pretty stark contrast compared to having to micromanage lots and lots of additional elements added onto a miniature. It makes a big difference. It's kind of crazy to me how specifically those miniatures really illustrated to me firsthand the idea of less is more in a way that I had never understood previously. So what was the point? Why make the video? To just be contentious and grab those sweet YouTube clicks from angry wargamers? No, not at all. Because the thing is, if you feel that the negatives surrounding metal are still true after watching this, that's absolutely fine. I'm not here to tell you that you're wrong. I'm not here to disagree with you. If you've watched this much of a video and still disagree with the points being made in it, that's fine, because at least you have now a perspective from somebody who loves metal miniatures, and that gives you a point of comparison against your own feelings on the subject. And that's what it's really about, isn't it? It's understanding perspective. You're always free to think and feel as you please, but it's the variety of different approaches and thoughts that make the hobby landscape so colourful and so interesting. However, at the same time, you may have been harbouring some misconceptions or some misunderstandings about metal miniatures, maybe through a lack of exposure or experience yourself, and so there's a possibility that this video could turn you around on that and you could enjoy them. After all, you could be missing out on a whole bunch of fun that you just never knew was there. Thanks for watching, folks.